The morning sun lazily penetrated through the enormous windows of the Harrison mansion, illuminating the impeccable marble floor and reflecting off walls decorated with expensive works of art. However, all that opulence couldn't disguise the deafening silence that hung in the air. Thomas Harrison, owner of one of the country's largest hotel chains, observed the landscape from his private office, an untouched cup of coffee on his solid mahogany desk. His green eyes, always attentive to numbers and spreadsheets, now wandered, distant across the horizon. At 45, Thomas had built an empire even larger than the one inherited from his father, but he felt an emptiness that no bank account could fill. His son Jason, 12 years old, was growing up amid luxury and comfort, but lacking the warmth that only a complete family could provide. The housekeeper, Mrs. Wilson, an austere lady who had worked for more than 2 decades at the residence, knocked lightly on the office door. "Mr. Harrison, we need to hire a new cook. The current one resigned this morning." The news only drew a tired sigh from the businessman. It was the 3rd employee to leave the mansion in less than 6 months. "Do what's necessary, Mrs. Wilson. Just make sure it's someone competent this time," he replied without taking his gaze from the window. The housekeeper hesitated for a moment, as if wanting to say something more, but chose to withdraw in silence, leaving Thomas alone again with his thoughts. Upstairs, Jason was in his room, surrounded by video games and expensive toys, but his gaze was fixed on an old photograph on the bedside table. In it, a brown-haired woman with a radiant smile held a baby in her arms. The boy barely remembered his mother, but felt her absence every day. The routine in the mansion followed an almost mechanical ritual. The employees performed their tasks with military precision, avoiding unnecessary conversations or displays of affection. Thomas had established rigid rules over the years, building an emotional fortress that kept everyone at a safe distance. That afternoon, while Mrs. Wilson conducted interviews for the cook position, one particular candidate caught her attention. Sarah Collins, 30 years old, brought modest recommendations, but her brown eyes conveyed an honesty and warmth that contrasted with the coldness of the environment. "Your experience is limited by the standards we usually require," commented the housekeeper, analyzing her resume with a critical air. Sarah adjusted herself in the chair, her hands interlaced on her lap, demonstrating contained nervousness. "Mrs. Wilson, I may not have worked in the best restaurants, but I learned to cook from my grandmother, who was a chef in a small but respected restaurant upstate. Every dish I prepare carries not only technique but also love and dedication," Sarah responded, her voice soft yet firm. The housekeeper raised her eyebrows, surprised by the sincerity of that response. Something about the candidate told her that she might be different from the other employees who had passed through the mansion. Perhaps that was exactly what that house needed, someone who brought a bit of human warmth to those cold walls. "Very well, Ms. Collins. I'll give you an opportunity. You can start tomorrow at 7 o'clock. I don't tolerate lateness," declared Mrs. Wilson, standing to end the interview. Sarah smiled, a genuine smile that illuminated her entire face. "You won't regret it, Mrs. Wilson. I promise to give my best," replied Sarah, also standing. As she left the mansion, she looked back one last time, observing the imposing construction. Little did she know that she was about to begin a journey that would change not only her life, but that of everyone who inhabited that place. The day was bidding farewell when Thomas finally left his office. In the hallway, he crossed paths with Jason, who was returning from school. The son barely raised his eyes to greet him, heading straight to his room. Thomas felt the weight of that distance, but didn't know how to cross the invisible wall he had built around himself over the years. The next morning brought a different energy to the Harrison mansion. Sarah arrived punctually at 7 o'clock, being received by Mrs. Wilson, who led her to the imposing kitchen. The environment, although equipped with the most modern appliances, seemed as cold as the rest of the house. "Here's the weekly menu. Mr. Harrison is quite demanding with his schedules. Breakfast should be served at 7:30, lunch at noon sharp, and dinner at 8 p.m. Young Jason usually has a snack at 3:30 p.m. when he returns from school," explained the housekeeper, handing a meticulously organized folder to the new employee. Sarah absorbed each piece of information with attention, her eyes scanning the kitchen while mentally planning how she would organize her workspace. There was something special about that place, despite the apparent coldness. It was as if the walls held stories of happier times waiting to be rediscovered. Her first task was to prepare breakfast. With precise and delicate movements, Sarah began to work, humming softly while separating the ingredients. The aroma of fresh bread soon filled the environment, mixing with the soft scent of flowers she had brought to decorate the kitchen table. Jason was the first to appear that morning, drawn by the aromas escaping from the kitchen. The boy entered timidly, his curious eyes observing the new employee. Sarah smiled when she saw him, a warm and genuine smile that made the boy pause for a moment. "Good morning. You must be Jason. I'm Sarah, the new cook. Would you like to try these cheese biscuits? They just came out of the oven," she offered, approaching with a steaming basket. The irresistible aroma made the boy's stomach growl, drawing a small embarrassed smile from his lips. "Can I really?" he asked, hesitant. It was the first time in a long time that someone had treated him so naturally in the mansion. Sarah nodded, placing the basket on the counter and indicating a high stool where he could sit. While Jason savored the cheese biscuit, Sarah prepared a special hot chocolate, a recipe from her grandmother that included a touch of cinnamon and vanilla. The boy watched, fascinated by her movements in the kitchen, so different from previous employees who just mechanically performed their tasks. "It's delicious," murmured Jason, surprising himself with his own words. He wasn't used to giving compliments, much less conversing with the employees. Sarah smiled again, her eyes shining with satisfaction. "I'm glad you liked it. You know, my grandmother always said that food made with love has a special flavor," she commented, while arranging the breakfast table with care. Jason remained there, quiet, but his eyes followed each of Sarah's movements with growing interest. Thomas entered the kitchen minutes later, surprised to find his son sitting at the counter. The businessman couldn't remember the last time he had seen Jason having breakfast outside his room. Sarah greeted him respectfully, but without losing that natural warmth that seemed to emanate from her presence. "Good morning, Mr. Harrison. Breakfast is served if you wish," she announced, indicating the beautifully arranged table. Thomas nodded mechanically, but his eyes caught something different in the environment. It wasn't just the inviting aroma or the impeccable organization. There was something more, something he hadn't felt in that house for a long time. During breakfast, Thomas discreetly observed his son, who for the first time in years was eating with true appetite. Sarah moved around the kitchen with a natural grace, creating a welcoming atmosphere that contrasted with the usual formality of the mansion. Mrs. Wilson, who observed everything from afar, allowed herself a small smile. Perhaps her intuition about Sarah was right. There was something special about that simple woman, something that went beyond her ability to cook well. At the end of breakfast, when Jason was preparing to go to school, something extraordinary happened. The boy stopped at the kitchen door, turned to Sarah, and in a shy but hopeful tone asked, "Will you make more cheese biscuits tomorrow?" Sarah felt her heart warm with that simple question, loaded with meaning. "Of course, and who knows, maybe we can try other special recipes too," she replied, winking at the boy. Jason left for school with a different gleam in his eyes, leaving behind a kitchen that for the first time in a long time seemed less like a service area and more like a true home. The following weeks brought a subtle but noticeable transformation to the Harrison mansion. Sarah's presence began to alter the dynamics of the house in unexpected ways. The kitchen, previously a merely functional environment, had become a meeting point where inviting aromas and discreet smiles began to break the rigidity established over the years. Jason especially showed notable changes. The boy started doing his homework at the kitchen table while Sarah prepared dinner. Initially he remained silent, but gradually he began to share small fragments of his school day. Sarah listened attentively to each word, responding with genuine interest and occasionally offering gentle advice. "You know, Sarah," said Jason one afternoon playing with his pen cap, "today at school for the first time, I raised my hand to answer a math teacher's question." His eyes shone with a mixture of pride and shyness. Sarah, who was preparing a cheese soufflé, paused for a moment to give the boy her full attention. "That's wonderful, Jason. And how did you feel?" she asked, her face illuminated by an encouraging smile. The boy reflected for a few seconds before answering. "It was different, good different. The teacher smiled at me, and some classmates greeted me after class," he confessed, a small smile playing on his lips. Thomas, who was passing through the corridor at that moment, stopped upon hearing the conversation. Hidden by the half-open door, he observed his son sharing experiences that he himself was unaware of. Something in his chest tightened as he realized how much of Jason's life he was missing behind the walls he had built around himself. Mrs. Wilson also noticed the changes. The mansion employees, previously tense and silent, began to show more naturalness in their tasks. The garden received more care, the curtains remained open longer, allowing natural light to penetrate the environments. It was as if the house was awakening from a long sleep. One afternoon, while Sarah was organizing the pantry, she found an old cookbook, its pages yellowed by time. As she leafed through it, she discovered handwritten notes with delicate calligraphy. "Those are Mrs. Allison's recipes, Mr. Harrison's first wife," explained Mrs. Wilson, who observed her from the door. Sarah felt the weight of that revelation. For the first time, she had a deeper glimpse of the story of pain that had shaped that family. With delicacy, she kept the book where she had found it, but that moment awakened in her a greater understanding of the environment in which she was inserted. Thomas, in turn, began to notice small changes in his routine. Breakfast, which before was just an obligation, became a moment that he secretly looked forward to. The dishes prepared by Sarah carried something beyond flavor. There was care, attention to detail, and a subtlety that made him remember happier times. One night, after a particularly stressful day at work, Thomas found on his desk a plate of cinnamon cookies, still warm, accompanied by a cup of chamomile tea. The simple but attentive gesture caught him by surprise. Upon tasting a cookie, a long-buried memory emerged, his mother doing something similar when he was a child. The most significant change, however, manifested in the small moments shared between father and son. During dinner, Jason commented animatedly about a science project he was developing at school. To his surprise, Thomas not only listened but asked questions, showing true interest. "Dad," called Jason, hesitant, "would you like to see my experiment tomorrow? It's about the solar system." The question hung in the air for a few seconds, loaded with expectation. Thomas felt Sarah's gaze upon him, not a look of judgment, but of gentle encouragement. "Of course, son," he replied, surprising himself with the naturalness of his response. "How about after dinner?" The smile that illuminated Jason's face was like a ray of sunshine breaking through clouds after a long storm. Sarah observed these interactions with discreet contentment. Without imposing her presence, she created spaces and moments that allowed the family to reconnect naturally. Her influence was like a soft spring breeze, bringing new life to a garden long abandoned. The routine of the mansion followed its transformed course when an unexpected event broke the established rhythm. On a rainy night, Thomas returned earlier from work, something extremely rare. Upon entering the kitchen in search of coffee, he found Sarah preparing hot chocolate, lost in her thoughts while observing the rain through the window. "Sorry, I didn't mean to startle you," he said, noticing the cook's startled reaction. Sarah quickly composed herself, but there was something different in her eyes, a sadness that she tried to hide. "Not at all, Mr. Harrison. Can I prepare some coffee for you?" she offered, already moving toward the coffee maker. Thomas, however, noticed a letter on the table, partially hidden by a kitchen towel. "No, thank you. Actually, that hot chocolate seems more tempting on this cold night," he replied, surprising himself with the informality of the comment. Sarah hesitated for a moment before serving 2 cups. The silence that followed wasn't uncomfortable like the usual ones in the mansion. It was a shared silence, filled only by the sound of rain hitting the windows. Thomas discreetly observed how Sarah held her cup with both hands, as if seeking more than just the warmth of the drink. "My mother," she suddenly began, her voice low but firm, "is facing some health problems. The letter is from her doctor." Sarah didn't know exactly why she was sharing that with her employer. but something about that rainy night seemed conducive to confidences. Thomas felt a lump in his throat. How long had it been since he had a real conversation with someone? "I'm sorry," he said, and for the first time in years, they were sincere words, not just a social courtesy. "You know," continued Sarah, turning to face the rain again, "sometimes I wonder if I made the right choice coming to work here. Maybe I should be closer to her." Her voice carried a vulnerability that touched something deep in Thomas. "Life is made of difficult choices," he replied, surprising himself with his own openness. "We don't always know if we're on the right path." His thoughts wandered to his own choices, to the walls he had built around his heart. At that moment, Jason entered the kitchen, his eyes widening when he saw his father and Sarah talking. "Is everything okay?" asked the boy, his concern evident in his voice. Sarah quickly opened a smile, although her eyes still held a touch of melancholy. "Of course, sweetie. How about some hot chocolate? There's still plenty here." The boy approached, sitting between the two adults. For a few minutes, the three remained in silence, drinking hot chocolate and listening to the rain. It was a simple moment, but loaded with meaning. For the first time, they seemed like a real family. "Sarah," called Jason after a while, "could you teach me how to make hot chocolate like this? I want to be able to prepare it for my mom when she's sick." The innocence of the request made Sarah's eyes fill with tears. Thomas felt his heart tighten. His son, who barely managed to express emotions, was demonstrating empathy and care. Sarah had awakened something precious in Jason, something that he as a father hadn't managed to do in years. "Of course I'll teach you, my angel," replied Sarah, her voice husky with emotion. "We can start tomorrow. How about that?" Thomas observed the interaction with a mixture of gratitude and sadness. Sarah had brought new life to his house, warmth to his son, and without him realizing it, was beginning to melt the ice that had enveloped his own heart for so long. The rain continued falling outside, but inside the kitchen something new was blossoming. It was more than a simple nighttime conversation. It was the beginning of a connection that none of them expected to find. Thomas realized that, for the first time in a long time, he didn't feel alone. The morning brought with it the first rays of sunshine after the rainy night, but also carried in the air an unexpected tension. Richard Manning, financial manager of the Harrison Hotel chain and Thomas's right-hand man for more than a decade, arrived at the mansion for an emergency meeting. His normally impassive face showed an unusual restlessness. "Thomas, we need to talk," he announced as soon as he was led to the office. His gaze, when crossing with Sarah in the hallway, had been of poorly disguised disapproval. The cook felt a shiver run down her spine, like a premonition of coming problems. Inside the office, Richard wasted no time with formalities. "Do you realize what's happening in this house, Thomas? The employees comment, the partners speculate. A simple cook is having more influence over your son than any teacher or counselor we've hired." Thomas felt his face harden. "Richard, I appreciate your concern, but the affairs of my house are not on the agenda at board meetings," he replied, his voice controlled but firm. "It's not just that," continued Richard, ignoring the tone of warning. "There are rumors circulating. People notice how you've changed since she arrived. Some question whether you're being manipulated." The last word came out loaded with insinuations. In the hallway, Sarah organized the breakfast tray that would be served during the meeting. Trying to ignore the sideways glances she received from the other employees, Mrs. Wilson, noticing her discomfort, discreetly approached. "Don't let them upset you, dear," whispered the housekeeper. "There are people who can't stand seeing others' happiness." It was the first time the lady had openly demonstrated her support for Sarah. Jason, who was coming down the stairs at that moment, stopped upon seeing the unusual movement in the house. His eyes met Sarah's, and he immediately perceived that something was wrong. With surprising maturity for his age, the boy approached the cook. "Sarah, you're going to help me with that recipe today, aren't you?" he asked loudly, making sure to be heard by all present. His small act of rebellion against the hostile atmosphere didn't go unnoticed. In the office, the discussion continued. Richard presented reports and numbers, but his true objective was clear: to create doubts in Thomas's mind about Sarah's presence in his house. Think about your reputation, Thomas. About the company's image. You built all this with so much sacrifice, argued Richard, his mellifluous voice masking the malice of his intentions. Thomas remained silent for a few moments, his thoughts returning to the previous night, to the moment of genuine connection he had shared with Sarah and Jason. He remembered his son's smile, the small progresses he observed day after day. "Richard," he began, his voice now carrying an authority that he hadn't demonstrated for a long time, "you're an excellent professional and a valuable collaborator, but there's a line you're crossing, and I cannot allow that." The manager tried to argue, but Thomas raised his hand, silencing him. "The affairs of my house and my family are private. If someone in the company is more concerned with my personal life than with their own responsibilities, perhaps it's time to re-evaluate some positions." The veiled threat didn't go unnoticed. Richard adjusted his tie, visibly uncomfortable. "I'm just trying to protect your interests, Thomas," he tried to justify. "My interests include my son's happiness," replied Thomas, standing to end the meeting. "And for the first time in a long time, I'm seeing real progress in that aspect." When Richard left the office, he found Jason and Sarah in the kitchen, together preparing what seemed to be cake batter. The smile on the boy's face, something so rare until a few months ago, was like a silent answer to all his accusations. Sarah maintained her dignity, greeting him politely as he passed. Her eyes, however, carried a new determination. She was beginning to understand that her presence in that house represented more than just a job. It was the beginning of a transformation that bothered those who benefited from the old order of things. The incident with Richard left subtle marks on the mansion's routine. The employees, previously just distant, now divided between those who silently supported Sarah and those who shared the financial manager's suspicions. The tension was palpable, but something unexpected began to happen. The more some tried to create barriers, the stronger the bond between Sarah, Jason, and Thomas became. One afternoon, while Sarah organized the ingredients for dinner, she found a folded note under a plate in the kitchen. Upon opening it, her heart accelerated. It was a drawing made by Jason, depicting 3 stick figures, one tall, one medium, and one small, all holding hands with a large red heart in the background. "I thought you'd like to see this," said Mrs. Wilson, entering the kitchen at that moment. "Jason spent the whole morning working on this drawing, hidden in the garden." The housekeeper smiled, her eyes revealing a deep understanding of the situation. Sarah held the drawing to her chest, moved. "You know, Mrs. Wilson, sometimes I wonder if I'm causing more problems than help in this house," she confessed, her voice low and thoughtful. The housekeeper approached, placing a gentle hand on Sarah's shoulder. "My dear, in 20 years working in this house, I've never seen Jason so happy. And Mr. Harrison, well, he's returning to being the man I knew so long ago." That same afternoon, Thomas returned earlier from work, something that was becoming more frequent. Upon entering the mansion, he was surprised by unusual sounds coming from the music room, a room that had remained closed for years since the death of his first wife. Approaching silently, he saw through the half-open door a scene that made his heart stop for an instant. Jason was sitting at the piano, his small hands hesitant over the keys, while Sarah, seated at his side, patiently guided his fingers through the notes of a simple melody. "Mom played the piano, didn't she?" asked Jason, his voice loaded with curiosity and a touch of sadness. Sarah nodded softly. "Yes, dear. Mrs. Wilson told me that she was a wonderful pianist," replied Sarah with delicacy. "And you have the same long fingers that she had. You were born for music, you know?" Thomas remained motionless, observing the interaction. Sarah wasn't trying to replace Allison's memory. On the contrary, she was helping Jason connect with her in a way that he himself had never managed. "Dad!" exclaimed Jason, finally noticing Thomas's presence at the door. "Sarah is teaching me to play the song that you always hummed when I was little." Thomas entered the room, his eyes meeting Sarah's. There was so much to be said, so many unspoken emotions circulating in the air. Instead of words, he simply sat in an armchair near the piano. "May I listen?" he asked, his soft voice revealing a vulnerability that surprised everyone, including himself. For almost an hour, father and son shared a moment that seemed taken from a long-forgotten dream. Jason, encouraged by the presence of both, practiced with dedication each note, his face illuminated by a happy concentration. Sarah observed the scene with her heart overflowing with affection. It wasn't just music that was being created in that room. It was the reconstitution of a family, the healing of old wounds, the birth of something new and precious. When the sun began to set, casting golden rays through the windows of the room, Thomas realized he was smiling. Not the contained and professional smile he used to display, but a genuine smile, which reached his eyes and warmed his chest. "Sarah," called Jason as they were putting away the sheet music, "do you think Mom would be happy to see me playing?" The question caught everyone by surprise. Sarah looked at Thomas, seeking in his eyes permission to respond. What she found was much more than that. It was trust, gratitude, and something deeper that neither of them was ready to name. The peace that was beginning to establish itself in the Harrison mansion was abruptly interrupted on a Monday morning. Victoria Harrison, Thomas's mother and matriarch of the family, arrived without warning, her high heels echoing through the corridors like a harbinger of changes. "My son," her cutting voice reverberated through the entrance hall, "we need to talk." Victoria was an imposing woman who carried with her decades of tradition and power. Her perceptive eyes registered every detail of the mansion, detecting the small changes that had occurred during her absence. Thomas, who was in his office, felt a tightness in his chest upon hearing his mother's voice. He knew that tone well. It was the same one she used when she was about to interfere in his life, always under the pretext of protecting the family's interests. "Richard called to me," announced Victoria as soon as Thomas appeared, "and I confess that I was deeply concerned with what he told me." Her eyes narrowed when she saw Sarah passing discreetly through the corridor. In the kitchen, Sarah tried to maintain calm while preparing lunch. Victoria's presence had completely changed the atmosphere of the house. The employees went back to walking on tiptoes, exchanging apprehensive glances. "Don't let her intimidate you," whispered Mrs. Wilson, who knew well the power that Victoria exerted over the family. "Stay firm in your work." Jason, who was returning from school, stopped surprised to see his grandmother. His body instantly tensed, the natural joy of recent times giving way to a rigid and formal posture. "Jason, darling," Victoria opened her arms to her grandson, but her embrace was as cold as marble. "How is my little heir? I heard that you've been very close to the maid." The last word came out loaded with disdain. The boy didn't respond, his eyes instinctively seeking Sarah in the kitchen. Victoria noticed the gesture, and her face hardened even more. "Thomas," she called, her voice now dangerously soft. "Let's go to your office. We have much to discuss about the future of this family." Inside the office, Victoria wasted no time with circumlocutions. "Have you lost your mind? Allowing a maid to have so much influence over Jason? Over this house? What would Allison think of this?" The mention of Allison's name hit Thomas like a physical blow. "Mother, don't use Allison's memory to manipulate this situation," he replied, his voice trembling slightly. "Manipulate?" Victoria laughed without humor. "I'm trying to preserve this family's legacy. Richard told me about the changes in your behavior, about how you've been neglecting important company decisions to spend more time at home." In the hallway, Jason listened to the discussion, his heart beating rapidly. Without thinking twice, he ran to the kitchen, where Sarah was preparing tea to calm her own nerves. "Sarah," he called, his voice urgent, "you're not going to leave, are you? Promise you won't leave me." The cook felt her heart tighten when she saw the fear in the boy's eyes. She knelt to be at his height, her hands gently holding his shoulders. "Jason, listen," she began, carefully choosing her words. "There are things in life that we cannot control. But know that no matter what happens, the affection I feel for you is true and will never change." In the office, the discussion continued. Victoria presented calculated arguments, touching on old wounds and deep fears of Thomas. "Think about Jason's future," she insisted. "What kind of example are you setting for your son, allowing him to become attached to someone so inferior to our position?" Thomas closed his eyes for a moment, remembering the positive changes he had observed in his son in recent months. Jason's free laughter, his renewed interest in music, the way his eyes shone when he talked about his day. "Mother," he finally said, his voice finding a firmness that surprised them both, "I appreciate your concern, but the decisions about this house and about raising my son are mine." Victoria straightened in her chair, her eyes flashing with indignation. "You're making a terrible mistake, Thomas, and when you realize it, it may be too late." Rising with all her aristocratic dignity, Victoria walked to the door. Before leaving, she turned one last time. "Don't think this conversation is over. There's much more at stake than you imagine." The days that followed Victoria's visit were tense in the Harrison mansion. The heavy atmosphere lingered over everyone like laden clouds before a storm. Sarah continued her tasks with the same dedication as always, but her smile no longer reached her eyes with the same frequency. Thomas spent more time in the office, immersed in reports and phone calls. However, his thoughts constantly wandered to his mother's words, to the fear of truly making a mistake, not for himself but for Jason. On a particularly difficult afternoon, while reviewing some contracts, Thomas was surprised by sounds coming from the garden. Approaching the window, he saw a scene that made his heart tighten. Jason and Sarah were sitting on the grass, surrounded by school books. "So, if we multiply these numbers," explained Sarah patiently, while Jason frowned in concentration. "Ah, now I understand," exclaimed the boy, his eyes shining with the satisfaction of discovery. "Sarah, you explain math much better than my teacher." Thomas observed how his son, previously so reserved and insecure with studies, now showed true enthusiasm in learning. It wasn't just the teaching method, it was the environment of security and affection that Sarah created around him. Mrs. Wilson, who also observed the scene from afar, approached Thomas silently. "You know, sir," she began, her voice loaded with years of wisdom, "in all these years I've never seen Jason so happy and confident." Thomas turned to the housekeeper, surprised by her initiative to comment on something so personal. Mrs. Wilson continued, "When Mrs. Allison left us, this house lost its soul. Sarah, she brought that soul back." The housekeeper's words hit Thomas deeply. He remembered how the mansion was before, a cold place where Jason's laughter was rare and contained. Now, even with all the recent tensions, there was life again between those walls. In the garden, Sarah and Jason had finished studying and were now planning a small garden. "We can plant basil thyme," suggested Sarah, while Jason animatedly noted each idea. "And strawberries," added the boy. "Dad always said Mom loved strawberries." Sarah smiled softly. "Then strawberries will be our first planting," she agreed, touched by how Jason naturally included his mother's memory in his plans. That night during dinner, something unexpected happened. Jason, who usually ate in silence, began to animatedly tell about his plans for the garden. Thomas, instead of just nodding distractedly as he used to do, engaged in the conversation. "Strawberries, huh?" he commented, a soft smile playing on his lips. "Did you know that your mother used to make the best strawberry pie I've ever tasted?" Jason's eyes widened. It was rare for his father to speak spontaneously about Allison. "Really, Dad? What was it like?" Thomas began to describe the pie, each detail bringing with it precious memories that had long been put away. Sarah, who was serving dessert, listened attentively, her heart warmed by the intimacy of the moment. "Perhaps," began Sarah hesitantly, "when our strawberries grow, we could try to recreate the recipe." The silence that followed was loaded with emotion. Thomas looked at Sarah, seeing in her eyes not an attempt to replace the past, but a genuine desire to honor it, to help Jason connect with his roots. "I think Allison would have liked that," he finally replied, his voice soft but firm. At that moment, observing his son smile and Sarah blush slightly, Thomas felt a certainty form in his heart. His mother's words, though still echoing in his mind, lost strength in the face of the reality he saw before him. A family rebuilding itself, a love growing not to replace the old one, but to create something new and equally precious. The morning began with disturbing news. Richard had called an emergency meeting of the Hotel Chains Board, claiming to have crucial information about Thomas's management. The businessman knew that it was just another attempt at pressure, but something in his gut told him that this time would be different. Sarah noticed the tension as soon as Thomas came down for breakfast. His hands trembled slightly as he held the cup, and his eyes seemed distant, worried. Without saying anything, she placed before him a slice of cinnamon cake, still warm, the same one she had prepared on the night they had talked during the rain. "Thank you," he murmured, a small smile appearing on his lips at recognizing the gesture. For a moment their gazes met, loaded with unspoken words. Jason, who was coming down the stairs at that instant, stopped upon feeling the different atmosphere in the kitchen. "Dad, are you going to work today? I thought we could start the garden." "I'm sorry, son," replied Thomas, his heart tightening at seeing the disappointment in the boy's eyes. "I have an important meeting, but I promise that on the weekend we'll dedicate a special time to that." Sarah intervened gently. "Jason, how about we take advantage to prepare the soil? That way, when your dad returns, we can plant together." Her eyes met Thomas's again, transmitting silent support. At the company headquarters, the tension was palpable. Victoria was already present, seated to Richard's right, her elegant posture masking poorly contained satisfaction. The other board members whispered among themselves, casting furtive glances at Thomas when he entered the room. "Gentlemen," Richard began, his voice loaded with false concern, "I called this meeting because I discovered something disturbing about the current situation at our president's residence." Thomas felt his blood freeze. How dare Richard bring personal matters to a board meeting? "After a thorough investigation," continued the manager, "we discovered that the employee Sarah Collins is not who she claims to be. She omitted crucial information in her history." Victoria leaned slightly forward, her eyes shining with anticipation. Richard projected some documents on the room's screen. Sarah Collins abandoned her culinary studies in the last year after an incident with a professor. Additionally, she worked at a restaurant that went bankrupt under suspicious circumstances. Thomas clenched his fists under the table. That information, even if true, had nothing to do with the present, with the person that Sarah had shown herself to be. And most concerning, Richard made a dramatic pause, she has a considerable debt related to her mother's medical treatment. A person in that situation, having access to the intimacy of a family like the Harrisons— Enough! Thomas's voice thundered through the room, surprising everyone. He stood up, his hands firmly supported on the table. "This is absurd. Are we in a board meeting to discuss the personal life of an employee?" Victoria intervened, her mellifluous voice. "Thomas, dear, we're just concerned about the well-being of the family, with Jason's future." "No," cut Thomas, his voice now loaded, with an authority that he hadn't demonstrated for a long time. "This is a low attempt at manipulation. Sarah may have faced difficulties in the past, but I know her character. I've seen how she transformed my house, how she helped my son smile again." Richard tried to argue, but Thomas raised his hand, silencing him. "If you want to discuss business, great, but my personal life and the people I choose to have by my side are not on the agenda." Turning to his mother, Thomas continued, "And you, mother, who talk so much about protecting the family, when was the last time you saw Jason truly happy, that you heard him play piano or talk about his dreams?" The silence that followed was deafening. Victoria paled slightly, while the other board members shifted uncomfortably in their chairs. "This meeting is adjourned," declared Thomas, gathering his belongings. "And Richard, I suggest you focus on your own responsibilities from now on." As he left the room, Thomas felt his heart beating rapidly. For the first time in a long time, he had defended not only Sarah, but also his own happiness. However, a concern consumed him. How would she react when she learned that her past had been exposed in that manner? When Thomas returned to the mansion that afternoon, he found Sarah and Jason in the garden, their hands dirty with soil and smiles on their faces. They had spent the morning preparing the ground for the future garden, and the scene so simple, and true, made his heart tighten even more with the events of the meeting. "Dad, look!" exclaimed Jason, running in his direction. "Sarah taught me everything about soil and seeds. We've already marked where we're going to plant each thing." Thomas smiled, stroking his son's hair, but Sarah immediately noticed that something troubled. His eyes, always so expressive, carried a deep concern. "Jason, dear," called Sarah, "how about going to take a bath? Afterward, we can discuss which seeds we'll buy first." The boy nodded, running into the house. Sarah stood up, cleaning her hands on her apron, her eyes fixed on Thomas. "Something happened at the meeting, didn't it?" she asked softly. Thomas sighed, sitting on the garden bench. Sarah accompanied him, maintaining a respectful distance, but her heart was beating rapidly. "Sarah," he began, his voice loaded with emotion, "I need to be honest with you. Richard, he investigated your past. He brought some information to the board today." Sarah's face paled slightly, but she remained firm. "I understand," she responded quietly. "I imagine that now you want me to—" "No," interrupted Thomas, turning to face her. "I don't care what happened in the past. I don't care that you left college or that you have debts with your mother's treatment." Sarah felt tears forming in her eyes. "How can you say that? I should have told you everything before." "Why?" questioned Thomas, his voice gentle. "So that we could judge you for your difficulties, instead of knowing the wonderful person that you are." A silence established itself between them, filled only by the sound of the wind in the leaves and the distant singing of birds. "You know," continued Thomas, "today at the meeting, for the first time in years, I really understood something. I understood that I was so worried about protecting my heart from pain that I ended up forgetting how it was to truly live." Sarah looked at him, surprised by his emotional openness. Thomas took her hands in his, not caring about the soil that still stained them. "You brought life back to this house, Sarah, not just with your food or your work, but with your heart. You helped Jason reconnect with his mother's memory in a way that I never managed. You taught us to smile again." Tears now ran freely down Sarah's face. "I never wanted to replace anyone," she whispered. "I just wanted to help." "And you did help," responded Thomas, his voice husky. "More than you can imagine. So, I don't care what Richard or anyone else says. What matters is what I see every day, a strong, dedicated woman who transformed our lives with her genuine love." At that moment, Jason returned to the garden, his hair still wet from the bath. Upon seeing the tears on Sarah's face, his countenance filled with concern. "Sarah? Dad? Is everything okay?" Thomas opened a reassuring smile. "Yes, son. In fact, it's better than ever." He stood up, extending his hands to Sarah and Jason. "How about we go choose these seeds for our garden together?" The smile that illuminated Jason's face was like a ray of sunshine after the storm. Sarah wiped away the tears, her heart overflowing with love for that family that had become hers. As they walked into the house, Thomas knew they would face more challenges ahead. His mother, Richard's society, all would have their opinions and judgments. But there at that moment, with the hands of his son and Sarah in his, he was sure that he was on the right path. Autumn arrived, bringing with it winds of change for the Harrison mansion. The small garden was beginning to bear its first fruits, a reflection of the care dedicated by Sarah, Jason, and, to everyone's surprise, by Thomas himself, who spent more and more time with the family. On a particularly pleasant afternoon, while harvesting the first aromatic herbs, Jason made an announcement that caught everyone by surprise. "Ms. Johnson asked me to play piano at the end-of-year school presentation." Sarah, who was pruning a basil plant, stopped immediately, her face lighting up with pride. Thomas, who was watering the still-growing strawberries, felt his heart quicken with the news. "Son, that's wonderful," exclaimed Sarah, spontaneously hugging the boy. Realizing her impulsive gesture, she backed away a little, but Jason hugged her back tightly. "I only accepted because you helped me practice, Sarah," he confessed, his face flushed with emotion. "And because," he hesitated, looking at his father, "because I want Mom, wherever she is, to hear me play." Thomas felt his eyes well up. He approached his son and knelt to be at his height. "She will hear, Jason, and I'm sure she'll be very proud." Mrs. Wilson, who observed the scene from the veranda, smiled discreetly. The mansion, previously so silent, now lived filled with music, laughter, and the aroma of fresh treats coming out of the oven. The days that followed were of intense preparation. Jason practiced with dedication, alternating between moments of frustration and small victories. Sarah was always nearby, offering not only musical support, but also hot chocolate and words of encouragement in difficult moments. One night after dinner, Thomas found Sarah in the kitchen organizing some old recipes she had discovered in a drawer. Among them was a notebook with Allison's delicate handwriting. "They're her recipes," said Thomas softly, making Sarah startle. Allison loved experimenting with new dishes, especially desserts. Sarah respectfully closed the notebook, but Thomas took it and began to leaf through it. "You know," he continued, "for a long time I kept all her memories as if they were untouchable relics. I ended up forgetting that memories are made to be shared, to keep alive the love we feel." "Thomas," began Sarah, her voice trembling slightly, "sometimes I wonder if I'm not occupying a space that doesn't belong to me." He closed the notebook and looked deeply into her eyes. "Sarah, you're not occupying anyone's place. You're creating your own space with your own love, and that's something precious." At that moment, they heard the first notes of Für Elise coming from the music room. Jason was practicing again, each note sounding more confident than the previous one. "He chose that music because it was her favorite," revealed Thomas, his voice husky. "Allison used to play it on summer nights when the garden was in bloom." Sarah smiled softly. "It's a perfect choice then, a way to honor the past while building the future." Thomas took her hand, a simple gesture but loaded with meaning. Together they walked to the music room, where they found Jason totally absorbed in his practice. Mrs. Wilson, passing through the corridor, stopped to observe the scene. Sarah and Thomas, side by side, listening to Jason play, their faces illuminated by a love that transcended conventional definitions. It was a family rebuilding itself, finding its own rhythm, its own melody. "Dad," "Sarah," called Jason, turning on the piano bench, "do you think I'm improving?" "You're amazing, my love," replied Sarah, before containing herself with the use of the affectionate term. But Jason smiled, his eyes shining with happiness. "Thank you, Mom," he whispered, the words coming out naturally as if they had long been waiting to be said. The silence that followed was filled only by the sound of the wind in the curtains and the accelerated beating of three hearts that finally found their perfect harmony. The word Mom echoed through the music room, transforming that moment into something magical and irreversible. Sarah felt her heart overflow with emotion, while Thomas observed the scene with moist eyes. It was as if all the pieces of a puzzle finally found their places. "Jason," began Sarah, her voice husky, "You don't need to say anything," interrupted the boy, getting up from the piano and running to hug her. "I know you don't want to replace my mom. No one ever could. But you brought love back to our house, and that makes you special in your own way." Thomas joined the hug, enveloping the two in his arms. Mrs. Wilson, who still observed discreetly from the door, felt her own eyes fill with tears. After so many years of silence and pain, the Harrison mansion was once again becoming a true home. The days that followed were of a tranquil and deep happiness. The news that Jason had called Sarah Mom circulated quickly among the employees, who now treated her with even more respect and affection. Even the most resistant could not deny the positive impact she had on the family. One morning, while Sarah prepared coffee, Richard unexpectedly appeared at the mansion. His face was tense, and he carried a folder of documents under his arm. "I "Need to speak with Thomas," he announced to Mrs. Wilson, who received him with courteous coldness. Thomas, who was in the garden with Jason, headed to the office to receive the manager. Sarah felt her heart tighten, fearing that more problems might be coming. "Thomas," began Richard, his tone more humble than usual, "I came to apologize. My behavior in recent weeks was inappropriate." The businessman observed his manager in silence, waiting for him to continue. "Yesterday I watched my daughter's piano presentation at school," continued Richard, "and for the first time in years, I really paid attention. You know what I saw? A lonely child who barely smiles. Just as Jason was before." Thomas felt his expression soften. Richard wasn't a bad man. He was just as lost in appearances and power as he himself had once been. "Sarah transformed this house," continued Richard, "and more importantly, transformed Jason. Any idiot can see that. I was wrong to try, to interfere." "Thank you, Richard," replied Thomas simply. "Your honesty means a lot." When Richard left, he found Sarah in the hallway. To her surprise, he made a small gesture of reverence with his head. "Ms. Sarah," he said respectfully, before departing. That night, during dinner, Jason was especially animated. "Only 2 weeks until the presentation," he exclaimed, barely touching his food. "And you're more than prepared," assured Sarah, serving more juice in his glass. "But you need to eat well to maintain your energy." Thomas observed the interaction with a smile on his face. How hadn't he realized before? Love doesn't diminish when it's shared. It multiplies, grows, overflows. "Sarah," he called softly, making her turn in his direction. "I think it's time we made some things official." Jason stopped eating, his eyes wide with expectation. Mrs. Wilson, who was passing through the dining room, also stopped to listen. "I know it's still early, that perhaps we should wait longer," continued Thomas, standing from his chair. "But some things don't need time when they're true." Sarah felt her heart accelerate when Thomas approached, taking her hands in his. "You transformed our lives, brought light where there was darkness, love where there was fear. And if Jason already recognizes you as mother in his heart, I think it's time to make that official in all possible ways." The night of the piano presentation finally arrived. The school auditorium was packed with parents, teachers, and students, all elegantly dressed for the occasion. Jason, backstage, nervously adjusted the bow tie that Sarah had chosen especially for him. "What if I make a mistake?" he whispered, his hands trembling slightly while he fingered an imaginary score in the air. Sarah, who was at his side, affectionately, straightened a rebellious lock of his hair. "Dear, there's no mistake when you play with your heart," she replied softly. "Besides, you're more than prepared. Remember all the mornings and afternoons you practiced." Thomas approached, carrying something in his hands. A small blue velvet box. "Jason, before you go on stage, there's something your mother and I would like to give you." The boy looked curiously at Sarah, who seemed as surprised as he was. Thomas opened the box, revealing a delicate silver piano brooch. "It was your mother Allison's," explained Thomas, his voice husky with emotion. "She always wore it in her presentations. And now," he made a significant pause, looking at Sarah, "with the blessing of the love she left us, we want you to wear it today." With trembling hands, Sarah took the brooch and carefully pinned it to the lapel of Jason's suit jacket. The boy touched the object with reverence, feeling a deep connection with the past and present. "Now you carry a bit of both mothers with you on stage," said Thomas, hugging his son. Mrs. Wilson, who observed the scene from backstage, discreetly wiped away a tear. In her many years of service to the Harrison family, she had never witnessed such a genuinely moving moment. The auditorium lights began to blink, signaling that the presentation was about to begin. Jason took a deep breath, straightening his shoulders with renewed confidence. "You'll stay right here, won't you?" he asked, anxiously looking at Sarah and Thomas. "We'll be in the front row," assured Sarah, kissing his forehead. "And I'm sure your mother Allison will be watching from a special place too." Thomas led Sarah to their seats in the audience, their hands naturally intertwined. Victoria, who was seated several rows behind, observed the couple with an indecipherable expression. When Jason took the stage, a respectful silence took over the auditorium. The boy sat at the piano, adjusted the bench, and before beginning, gently touched the brooch on his lapel. The first notes of Fur-Elise filled the environment, more secure and emotive than in any of the rehearsals. Sarah felt silent tears running down her face while Thomas gently squeezed her hand. In the audience, teachers and parents looked at each other impressed. It wasn't just the impeccable technique that drew attention, but the emotion that overflowed from each note. Jason played with soul, with love, with a maturity that transcended his age. Victoria, who initially maintained a rigid posture, began to surrender to the music. Her eyes, always so critical, now shone with something close to pride and understanding. When the last note sounded, there was a moment of reverent silence before the audience exploded into applause. Jason stood up, made an elegant bow, and with tears in his eyes looked directly at Sarah and Thomas in the front row. The moment he left the stage, he was enveloped in a tight hug by Sarah. "You were magnificent, my love," she exclaimed, not caring about the tears that stained her makeup. "It was for you," said Jason, still trembling with emotion, "for all my mothers, the one who gave me life and the one who taught me to live it again." Thomas hugged them both, forming a perfect circle of love and gratitude. At that moment, under the lights of the auditorium and cradled by the applause that still echoed, they were more than a reconstituted family. They were living proof that love, in all its forms, has the power to heal and transform. After the presentation, while the families dispersed through the school foyer, Victoria Harrison approached the group, her high heels echoing on the marble floor. Sarah instinctively tightened her grip on Jason's hand, but the boy remained firm at her side. "Jason," called Victoria, her voice softer than usual, "you were extraordinary tonight." She paused, her eyes finding the brooch on her grandson's lapel. "Allison, she would be very proud." Thomas observed his mother attentively, noticing something different in her always so rigid posture. Victoria hesitated for a moment before continuing. "Sarah," she said, turning to the cook, "I owe you an apology. I spent so much time concerned with preserving appearances that I forgot what really matters, my family's happiness." Sarah felt her heart accelerate with the unexpected words. "Mrs. Victoria," she began, but the matriarch raised her hand, requesting silence. "Please, let me finish," asked Victoria. "Today, seeing Jason at the piano, I realized that I was wrong. You're not erasing the past, you're helping my family build a future. And for that," her voice faltered slightly, "I am deeply grateful." Jason, moved by an impulse of affection, hugged his grandmother. Victoria, taken by surprise, let her mask of composure fall for a moment, returning the hug with genuine emotion. Thomas took advantage of the moment to make the announcement he had planned. "Mother, since we're having this conversation, Sarah and I have decided to get married." The silence that followed was broken by the sound of applause. Mrs. Wilson, who had discreetly arrived with other mansion employees to watch the presentation, couldn't contain her joy. Victoria looked long at her son, then at Sarah, and finally at Jason, who radiated happiness. "Well," she said, a small smile appearing on her lips, "I suppose we'll need to organize a ceremony worthy of the Harrisons." "Actually," interrupted Sarah gently, "Thomas and I would like something simple, in the mansion garden, just with the people who really matter." "In the garden?" repeated Victoria, arching an eyebrow. But then, looking again at the radiant smile of her grandson, she softened her expression. Perhaps that's exactly what this family needs. Something new, something true." Teacher Johnson approached the group, carrying a bouquet of flowers. "For our star pianist," she said, giving the flowers to Jason. "And for his family," she added, smiling warmly at Sarah and Thomas. On the way back home, Jason fell asleep in the back seat of the car, still holding his bouquet. Sarah affectionately adjusted a blanket over him, while Thomas drove in comfortable silence. "You know," he said softly, so as not to wake his son, "when Allison was gone, I thought I would never feel true happiness again. How wrong I was." Sarah extended her hand, touching his arm softly. "Love has many forms, many paths. Allison will always be part of this family, part of Jason's heart. And now, together, we can honor her memory by building more happy moments." When they arrived at the mansion, Mrs. Wilson was waiting for them with hot chocolate and freshly baked cookies. Jason, sleepy but happy, sat at the kitchen table, still wearing his concert attire. "Sarah," he called, between a sip of chocolate and another, "when you and Dad get married, can I play piano at the ceremony?" "Of course, my love," she replied, exchanging an emotional look with Thomas. It couldn't be any other way. Mrs. Wilson, observing the scene, thought about how life took curious turns. The mansion, which for so long had been just a big empty house, was once again becoming a true home. And Sarah, who had arrived as a simple cook, had proven that love, when genuine, knows no social barriers or prejudices. The weeks that preceded the wedding brought a different bustle to the Harrison mansion. The garden, which Sarah and Jason had begun to cultivate with such care, now bloomed in an explosion of colors and scents. The strawberries planted in honor of Allison were especially vibrant, as if they too wanted to participate in the celebration. On a particularly sunny morning, Sarah found Jason sitting at the edge of the flower bed, thoughtfully observing the flowers. She sat beside him, respecting his moment of reflection. "Sarah," he began after a few moments, "do you think we can use some of these strawberries to make the pie that was Mom's favorite?" She smiled softly, putting her arm around the boy's shoulders. "Of course, my love. In fact, I was thinking of something special. How about we make this pie together, using her recipe from the notebook?" Jason's eyes brightened with the idea. "Can we serve it at the wedding, as a way to have her present too?" "That's a wonderful idea," replied Sarah, her heart overflowing with love for this boy who could unite past and present so naturally. Thomas, who observed the scene from the veranda, felt a deep peace settle in his chest. Mrs. Wilson approached him carrying some papers. "The final details for the ceremony, sir," she said, but her tone was more of a friend than an employee. "Victoria called earlier. She said she found some things that perhaps you'd want to use." Later that day, Victoria arrived at the mansion carrying an old cedar box. "These are some of Allison's things," she explained, her voice soft. "I thought Sarah should see them." Sarah, who was in the kitchen with Jason preparing the strawberry pie, felt her heart quicken when Victoria entered the room. But the matriarch's smile was genuine, without any trace of the former hostility. "Come, dear," called Victoria, placing the box on the table. "Jason, you too." Inside the box was a delicate antique lace veil, some photographs, and a pearl necklace. "Allison wore this veil at our wedding," explained Thomas, who had just entered the kitchen. "It was a family heirloom. And now," completed Victoria, carefully taking the veil, "we want you to wear it, Sarah. Not to replace Allison, but to officially become part of this family that you've already won over with your love." Sarah felt silent tears running down her face as she delicately touched the lace. Jason hugged her waist, resting his head on her shoulder. "There's one more thing," said Victoria, removing an envelope from the box. "Allison wrote this letter for Jason, asking that it be delivered, when he found a new mother in his heart." The silence in the kitchen was almost palpable. Jason took the envelope with trembling hands, looking questioningly at his father, who nodded encouragingly. "Dear Jason," he began to read, his voice choked. "If you're reading this letter, it means that what I most wished for has happened. Your heart has found space for a new maternal love. I want you to know that this makes me immensely happy." Sarah embraced Jason as he read, their tears mixing with his. Thomas joined the embrace, and even Victoria, breaking her habitual composure, approached to offer comfort. Allison's letter was a blessing, a precious gift that transcended time and longing. She spoke of unconditional love, of hope, and of the certainty that happiness would find its way back to her family's heart. "There's a special part for you, Sarah," said Jason, turning the page. She wrote, "To the woman who brought light back to my son's eyes, eternal gratitude. Take care of them with the same love that I see you already have in your heart." Mrs. Wilson, who observed the scene from the door, smiled through her own tears. The aroma of the strawberry pie in the oven mixed with the perfume of the garden flowers, creating an atmosphere of coziness and renewal. "I think it's time we try this pie," suggested Victoria, surprising everyone with her relaxed tone. Alison always said that there's no sad moment that a piece of strawberry pie can't improve. The wedding day dawned with a golden light that seemed to bless the garden of the Harrison mansion. The flowers, carefully cultivated by Sarah and Jason, formed a natural and welcoming setting. Small white tables were arranged among the flower beds, and an arch covered with white roses marked the ceremony location. In the main suite, Victoria helped Sarah with the final details of the dress, a simple but elegant model that perfectly reflected the bride's personality. Alison's antique lace veil rested delicately on her dark hair. "You know," began Victoria, adjusting the pearl necklace on Sarah's neck, "I never thought I would say this, but you brought something precious back to this family, the ability to love without fear." In the room next door, Thomas helped Jason with his bow tie. The boy proudly wore the piano brooch on his lapel, a tangible connection between past and present. "Dad," called Jason, his voice serious, "I wanted to tell you something. I think Mom Allison sent Sarah to us, to take care of us and teach us to be happy again." Thomas hugged his son, moved by the wisdom contained in those simple words. "I think you're right, son. Very right." Mrs. Wilson coordinated the final preparations in the garden, ensuring that everything was perfect. The tables were decorated with simple arrangements of flowers from the garden itself, and in the center of each, small vases of freshly picked strawberries served as a living reminder of the love that united that family. When the music began, the first notes of Für Elise played by Jason on the piano that had been specially brought to the garden, the guests turned to see Sarah walking through the natural corridor formed between the flowery beds. Thomas, waiting under the arch of roses, felt his heart skip a beat. Sarah was radiant, not only for her outer beauty, but for the light that seemed to emanate from within her, the light of true love that had transformed their lives. Jason played, with all his soul, each note loaded with emotion and meaning. When he finished the music, he ran to join his father and Sarah under the flower arch, completing the perfect picture of a family reunited by love. The ceremony was simple and deeply emotional. The vows, written from the heart, spoke of new beginnings, of love that transcends barriers, and a family that is chosen every day. "Sarah," said Thomas in his vows, "you taught us that love has no limits, that family is much more than blood ties. It's choice, it's care, it's being present in all moments." "Thomas, Jason," replied Sarah, her voice husky with emotion, "you showed me that the most beautiful dreams are those we don't even dare to dream. Today I'm not just getting married, I'm joining a family that I already carry in my heart." Victoria, seated in the front row, discreetly held an embroidered handkerchief. Beside her, Mrs. Wilson smiled openly, her tears of happiness not contained at all. After the exchange of rings, Jason surprised everyone with a special gesture. He removed the piano brooch from his lapel and pinned it on Sarah's dress. "Now you also carry a little piece of Mom Allison," he said simply. The moment of the strawberry pie was especially significant. Sarah and Jason had prepared it together, following exactly the recipe from Allison's notebook. Each guest who tasted it commented on how the flavor brought a sensation of love and coziness. At the end of the celebration, while the guests danced and talked in the garden illuminated by small lights, Thomas, Sarah, and Jason moved away for a moment, observing the scene. "Look," pointed Jason to the sky where a particularly bright star twinkled. "I think Mom Allison is sending a kiss to us." Sarah hugged the boy, feeling Thomas envelope them both. There, under the starry sky, amid the garden they had cultivated. Together they were more than a reconstituted family. They were living proof that love, when true, has the power to heal, transform, and create new beginnings. The first months after the wedding brought a different routine to the Harrison mansion. Sarah, who before occupied only the kitchen, now filled each room with her loving presence. The room that once held only sad memories had been transformed into a welcoming space, decorated with old and new photos, honoring the past while celebrating the present. On a Sunday morning, while the family had breakfast on the veranda, a new habit they had developed, Jason made a surprising announcement. "Ms. Johnson invited me to play at the State Music Festival," he said, between one bite of pancake and another. She said my performance at the wedding convinced her that I'm ready. Sarah, who was serving fresh orange juice, stopped mid-movement. Thomas lowered his newspaper, a proud smile illuminating his face. "That's wonderful, son," exclaimed Sarah, hugging him. "When will it be?" "In 2 months," replied Jason, his eyes shining with expectation. "And I was thinking of composing something special, a new song." Thomas and Sarah exchanged surprised looks. "Compose?" asked Thomas softly. "Yes," continued Jason, now more hesitant. "I want to create a song that tells our story, how we were sad and how we found happiness again. I can call it 3 Hearts." Sarah felt tears forming in her eyes. Thomas rose from his chair and hugged his son, his emotion visible. "It's a beautiful idea, my love," said Sarah, joining the hug, "and I'm sure it will be a wonderful song." The days that followed were filled with the sound of the piano as Jason worked on his composition. Sarah spent hours at his side, sometimes just listening, other times offering small suggestions. Thomas frequently stopped on his way to the office, leaning on the doorframe to appreciate his son's progress. Victoria, who now regularly visited the mansion, was especially touched when Jason explained the meaning behind each note. "This softer part," he showed his grandmother, playing some delicate notes, "represents Mom Allison watching us from heaven, and when the melody becomes happier, it's when Sarah arrived in our lives." Mrs. Wilson, who spent more and more time in the music room with the excuse of cleaning the furniture, always ended up stopping to listen. "You know," she commented one afternoon to Sarah, "in all these years, I've never seen so much love overflowing from this house." One day, while Sarah organized some things in the closet, she found a box she hadn't noticed before. Inside it was an old diary of Thomas, begun shortly after Allison's departure. The pages were full of pain, loneliness, and fear of loving again. "Found this," she said softly that night, showing the diary to Thomas. "I'm sorry, I didn't mean to invade your privacy." Thomas took the diary, leafing through it carefully. "You know," he began, his voice loaded with emotion, "for a long time, I thought writing here was the only way to keep my heart alive. I was wrong. What really kept my heart beating was love. Love for Jason, memories of Allison, and then you." Sarah sat beside him on the bed, resting her head on his shoulder. From the next room, they could hear Jason playing his composition, each note more confident than the previous one. "I think we should write a new diary," she suggested. "Not to keep the pain, but to record our happiness, each special moment, each small achievement." "Like a family memory book?" asked Thomas, embracing her. "Exactly," smiled Sarah, "so that Jason, in the future, can read and understand how love can transform everything." That night, before sleeping, Thomas made the first entry in the new diary. "Today I realized that happiness isn't in forgetting the past, but in allowing it to teach us to love even more deeply in the present. Allison taught us to love, and Sarah taught us to love again. And Jason is living proof that love only multiplies when it's shared." The big day of the State Music Festival arrived, bringing with it a mixture of nervousness and expectation. The theater was packed, with participants from all parts of the state. Jason, backstage, firmly held the score of 3 Hearts, his original composition that had moved everyone during rehearsals. "Remember," said Sarah, adjusting his bow tie, "each note carries a little piece of our love." The piano brooch, Allison's gift, shone on his lapel like a lucky charm. Thomas observed the interaction with his heart overflowing with gratitude. Victoria, who had made a point of being present, surprised everyone by arriving earlier to support her grandson. "Jason," called the grandmother, giving him a small package. "I found this among the old family things. I thought you should have it." Inside the package was an old baton, with the initials TH delicately engraved. "It was your grandfather's," explained Victoria, her voice soft. "He was a conductor before taking over. The family business. Allison used to say that Jason inherited his musical talent." The boy held the baton with reverence, his eyes shining with emotion. "Thank you, Grandma," he whispered, spontaneously hugging her. When it was his turn to perform, Jason walked to the piano with a serene confidence. Before beginning, he looked at the first row where his family was gathered, Sarah and Thomas holding hands, Victoria with a proud smile, and even Mrs. Wilson, who had made a point of coming to watch. The first notes of Three Hearts filled the theatre, telling a story of love, loss, and new beginning. The soft melody of the beginning represented the happy days with Alison, followed by a more melancholic moment that portrayed the loneliness after her departure. Then, gradually, the music gained new life, new colors, until exploding in a celebration of joy and hope. In the audience, there wasn't a dry eye. Sarah cried silently, feeling each note resonate in her heart. Thomas squeezed her hand, sharing that precious moment. When the last note sounded, there was a moment of absolute silence before the audience exploded into applause. Jason stood up, bowed, and, with a radiant smile, pointed to the sky. A silent thank you to Alison. Backstage, after the presentation, the family gathered in an emotional hug. "You did it, my love," said Sarah, kissing his forehead. "You told our story in the most beautiful way possible." "Actually," replied Jason, "I told the story of love, of how it can have various forms, various moments, but never truly ends." Victoria, who observed the scene, finally realized the wisdom behind everything that had happened. Alison's love hadn't been replaced. It had been honored and multiplied through Sarah, creating something new and equally precious. Back at the mansion, while they celebrated with one of Sarah's famous strawberry pies, Jason made a special request. "Can we plant more flowers in the garden? I want it to be even more beautiful when I play there again." "Of course," replied Sarah, exchanging a knowing look with Thomas. "How about we start tomorrow?" Thomas smiled, observing his family gathered in the kitchen, the place where everything had begun. Mrs. Wilson, serving hot chocolate to everyone, seemed more like a caring grandmother than a housekeeper. That night before sleeping, Thomas made another entry in the new family diary. "Today, through Jason's music, our story gained a melody. Alison taught us that love is eternal. Sarah showed us that it can be reborn. And Jason proved to us that love is a symphony that continues playing even when we think the music has ended." The first anniversary of Sarah and Thomas's wedding was approaching, and with it a special surprise was being prepared. Jason, now an award-winning pianist on the rise, had spent weeks planning something in secret with the help of Mrs. Wilson and Victoria. The mansion garden, which a year before had been the setting for the wedding, was even more beautiful. The rose bushes had grown, the strawberries had prospered, and each flower bed told a story of love and dedication. Sarah spent hours there, caring for each plant with the same affection she dedicated to her family. On a particularly sunny morning, while Sarah prepared breakfast, Jason entered the kitchen with an envelope in his hands. "Sarah," he called, his voice overflowing with emotion, "I found something special in the old piano. I think Mom Alison left it for us to find at the right moment." Inside the envelope was a letter yellowed by time and a handwritten score. Sarah called Thomas, and together they sat at the kitchen table to read Jason's discovery. "Dear family," began the letter in Alison's delicate handwriting, "if you found this letter, it means that music has returned to fill our house. With it I send a melody that I composed thinking of the future, a future that, even without my physical presence, would be full of love." Thomas held Sarah's hand, while Jason ran to the piano with the score. The first notes filled the house, a soft and hopeful melody, which seemed to embrace everyone with its warmth. "It's beautiful," whispered Sarah, silent tears running down her face. "Alison really thought of everything." "She knew," replied Thomas, his voice husky, "knew that one day we would find our way back to happiness." Victoria, who had arrived silently during the music, approached the group. Alison was always like that, capable of seeing beyond the present, of believing in love even in the most difficult moments. Mrs. Wilson brought a tray with tea and freshly baked cookies, joining the family in that special moment. Jason continued playing, now mixing Alison's melody with excerpts from his own composition, Three Hearts, creating a perfect harmony. between past and present. You know, commented Jason, stopping for a moment, I think I understand now. Mom Allison didn't leave us. She just changed. The way of being present. She's in the songs I play, in the garden we cultivate, in the love we share. Sarah hugged the boy, feeling her heart overflow with love and gratitude. Thomas joined them, forming a family hug that symbolized everything they had built together. Victoria observed the scene with a soft smile, remembering how she had initially resisted this new family configuration. How wrong she was. Love didn't diminish when shared. It multiplied, creating new forms of happiness. Sarah, called Jason, returning to the piano, can I play Mom Allison's song on the day of your wedding anniversary? I want it to be a special surprise for all the guests. Of course, my love, replied Sarah, exchanging a knowing look with Thomas. It will be perfect. Mrs. Wilson, who had served that family for so long, smiled discreetly while collecting the tea tray. In all her years of service, she had never witnessed such a beautiful transformation. The mansion, previously a place of painful memories, now overflowed with life and love. That night, Thomas made another entry in the family diary. Today, Allison sent us one more gift, a melody that unites past and present, reminding us that true love is never lost. It just transforms, grows, and finds new ways to flourish. The day of Thomas and Sarah's first wedding anniversary dawned radiant. The Harrison Mansion garden was even more beautiful than on the wedding day, with flower beds in bloom and ripe strawberries perfuming the air. Jason had rehearsed tirelessly in recent weeks, mixing the melody left by Allison with his own composition, creating something unique and special. Mrs. Wilson and Victoria had helped with the preparations, transforming the garden into a magical setting for the celebration. The guests began to arrive in the late afternoon when the sun painted the sky with golden tones. Among them were Richard and his family, the former opponent now converted into a sincere friend after witnessing the positive transformation in the Harrisons' lives. Welcome, received Sarah, radiant in a light blue dress that matched the garden flowers. Thomas was at her side, his eyes shining with love and gratitude. Jason, elegant in his suit, anxiously awaited the moment of his special presentation. The piano had been placed in the same spot where it had been during the wedding, under the arch of roses that was now even more in bloom. Victoria, who the year before still struggled to accept the changes, was now one of the most enthusiastic hostesses. She had helped choose each decoration detail, including small strawberry arrangements that adorned the tables, a delicate tribute to Allison. When all the guests were seated, Jason walked to the piano. The brooch on his lapel shone under the soft lights that had been installed in the garden. A year ago, he began, his voice clear and confident, we celebrated here the love that transformed our family. Today I want to present something special, a song that unites past and present, a melody that speaks about how love can have many forms, but never ceases to exist. The first notes of Allison's composition filled the air, soft and delicate like a spring breeze. Gradually, Jason began to intertwine excerpts of Three Hearts, creating a harmony that spoke of love, loss, new beginning, and hope. Sarah and Thomas, hand in hand, felt each note resonate in their hearts. Victoria, seated beside them, let silent tears run down her face, finally understanding the perfection of that moment. Mrs. Wilson, who observed everything from her special place in the front row, thought about how that house had transformed. The painful silence had given way to a symphony of love, laughter, and life. When the last note sounded, mixing with the singing of the garden birds, there wasn't a dry eye among those present. Jason rose from the piano and ran to hug Sarah. "Can Thomas, this is our family," he said, his voice husky with emotion, "built with love, strengthened by longing, reborn through hope." Victoria joined the hug, followed by Mrs. Wilson. The guests applauded, moved by that pure and sincere demonstration of family love. Later, while the guests savored the traditional strawberry pie, now made with fruits from the garden itself, Sarah, Thomas, and Jason walked to the rosebed. There, together, they planted a new seedling, a special white rose that Sarah had saved for that occasion. "So that our love continues to grow," she said, her hands joining with Thomas's and Jason's in the fertile soil of the garden. The sun was setting on the horizon, painting the sky with colors that seemed to celebrate that moment. The Harrison mansion, previously a place of silences and longings, was now a true home, where love flourished in all its forms. Thomas, looking at his family gathered in the garden that meant so much to them, made a final note in the diary. "Today, our story gained one more chapter. It's not an ending. It's just the beginning of a new melody, a symphony of love that will continue playing for generations." And thus, under the starry sky, cradled by the music that still echoed in their hearts, Sarah, Thomas, and Jason celebrated not just one year of marriage, but the extraordinary journey that had transformed them into